In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King launched a Poor People's March on Washington, seeking economic justice for impoverished Americans. More than 50 years later, and with a right-wing Republican president in office, that movement has been revived. And some Christian leaders on the left are demanding a revolution against poverty. Joining me now from Atlanta to discuss this is the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and president of the non-profit Repairers of the Breach. William Barber, thank you for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you so much and glad to be with you.
The President of the United States says, quote, "No president has ever done what I have done for evangelicals or for religion itself." Do you agree with that?
No, I do not. I also don't agree that even evangelicals are supporting him. I think oftentimes in the media we use these terms that have been thrown at us. I'm an evangelical. If you look at the true meaning of evangelicalism, which means to preach good news to the poor, care for the brokenhearted, and care for the oppressed, what we see is a false kind of religion, a distorted moral narrative where evangelicalism has been hijacked. We have been forced to use these false framings like left versus right. There's no such thing as a left Christian versus a right Christian. You're either a Christian or you're not. And Orthodox Christianity says that what is most important is how you treat the poor, the children, the women, the sick, and the least of these. And on all of those accounts, Trump failed, but not just Trump. His enablers in the Senate failed. The Republican Party fails, and even those who have hijacked the word term evangelicals fail. Just because you say you're an evangelical, there's a scripture in the Bible that says there are many who say they love the Lord with their lips, but their heart is far from it. The heart of his policies are far from anything Orthodox Christianity calls us to care about in the public square.
But William Barber, this is a global debate, of course, and you say there's no left or right, and I'm sure many people would agree with you, but the reality is that if I was interviewing a quote-unquote right-wing evangelical leader on the show, and we've had right-wing evangelicals on the show, they would say, no, the most important issue is not poverty, it's abortion, for example. You know that in this country, in the United States, that's a big driving force for a lot of quote-unquote right-wing Christian evangelicals who don't agree with you.
But they can't say that biblically. You don't have text on abortion and hatred toward homosexuals. You do have 2,000 texts that say health care and children and the poor. So you can say whatever you want to, but it doesn't line up with Jesus, what we call the red letter of the Bible. And if you're an evangelical Christian, your public policy is not driven by a Republican Party or Democratic Party, a concept of left or concept of right. It is driven by Jesus and where Jesus stood on social issues of his time. I'm a theologian, trained theologian, is we have a battle of heresy versus Christian truth. And that is not a left-right issue when it comes to theology. Theology doesn't use those terms of left and right.
You mentioned the word heresy. When you see Donald Trump retweeting people saying he's the second coming of God, when you see some self-styled Christian evangelical leader saying he's been sent by God, how do you feel about that? How does that make you feel?
Heresy.
Why are they saying
theological malpractice.
Why are they saying it?
I don't know why they're saying it. You'd have to ask them. But what I can say is it's not biblical. And it doesn't line up with the example of Jesus Christ. As I said, you can say anything. You can decide that you're going to worship tomatoes or worship grapefruits. It does not make it biblical. It does not make it Christian.
I understood. You say you don't like the language of the religious right. You don't like the language of left and right. They're not really evangelicals. What do you call them then? How do you refer to these people? I just say they're religionists. They're religious nationalists. That's what they are. They are not rooted in Orthodox Christian viewpoints. You can't find this in true Christian values. Okay. And so what we're challenging people is read the Bible. Look at what history says. Look at what theology says. Now again, the slave master had his own religion. That doesn't make it right. Okay. Just because he had it. Right. And that's why you had the abolitionists and Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and others who said, no, that is not Christianity. It's something, but it's not Christianity. It's a religion, maybe the religion of racism, but it's not Christianity. You've called for a, quote, moral impeachment of Donald Trump. What does that mean exactly? Yeah. What that means is when we look at our deepest religious and constitutional values, we have 140 million people who are poor and low wealth in this country. And what has Trump and his enablers chose to do? Give tax breaks to the wealthy.
We have 30 million people in this country without health insurance. What has Trump and his enablers tried to do? They take free health care when they get elected to the Senate and the Congress, but they then work to cut health care for their very constituents. We have ecological devastation, 4 million families in this country that can't buy unleaded water but can get up every morning and buy unleaded gas. We have climate change issues. What has Trump and his enablers done? Instead of promoting the general welfare that the Constitution requires, they are promoting the corporation and promoting fossil fuel companies. We have 53 cents of every discretionary dollar going toward military, most of it going toward defense contractors, and less than 15 cents going toward healthcare, infrastructure, and education. So that is not providing again for the common defense. We believe those things are directly opposite of our deepest constitutional and moral revivals and moral values. And on that, he should be impeached by the people.
So poverty is clearly a big issue in the US. Many would argue that Democrats have historically done a better job on poverty than Republicans when they're in the White House. But President Donald Trump would argue that the poverty rate for African Americans and for Hispanic Americans have reached an all-time low on his watch. And for once, the figures do seem to back him up. What's your response there?
Well, that's not true. What Donald Trump benefited from was the economic power of the economy that Obama presided over. But wealth and actual wealth has gone down among African Americans. And the reality is we have 26 million poor and low wealth African Americans in this country, 61% of all African Americans. But I want to talk about the other side, 66 million poor white people. This campaign that we are engaged in is in putting coal miners from Kentucky together with black folk from Louisville who are starting to understand that systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and this false moral narrative of religious nationalism is hurting all of us.
On that note, you mentioned white poverty. Let's talk about the intersection between poverty and racism, which is such an important intersection in this country. Because you mentioned how many white people are living in poverty, and yet a lot of poor white working class Americans in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan voted for Donald Trump in big numbers in 2016. And most of the academic studies suggest that they didn't vote because of economic anxiety, but because of their racial resentment, their antipathy towards immigrants and African Americans. How do you convince poor white Americans to stop voting against their own economic interests? How do you do that?
Well, actually, there was a study that came out after the election that said the poorest of whites did not vote for Trump. In addition to that, Trump lost by more than 3 million votes in the popular vote. He only won because of the Electoral College and a couple of states.
Agreed, but he did win the white working class vote by a big margin.
Well, he won, right, some of it, but there are 100 million people that didn't vote. How do you deal with this? You are exactly right. Dr. King said in '65 that every time there's the possibility for poor whites and poor blacks to come together and form a political base that changes the country, the white aristocracy sows division. How do you change that? You go. So our campaign is going to the back hills of Pennsylvania and Kentucky and down to the Delta of Mississippi. And we are pulling together people. We have 43 coordinating committees now made up of black and white and Latino people across this country. We have 100 partners, 15 denominational groups. We're planning a mass Poor People's Assembly march on Washington. We're engaged in a We Must Do More tour, mobilizing, organizing, educating, registering people for the movement who vote. You show people that the same people, for instance, that participate in racist voter suppression, once they get elected, they actually pass policies that hurt mostly white people. Because every state that's a racist voter suppression state is also a low-wage state and a high-poverty state. And when people see that, many of them begin to shift and recognize we have to build coalitions.
So that's interesting to hear you say that, because, of course, we've also seen many, many reports in the press and beyond of white working class voters who have either lost their jobs because of Trump's tariffs or lost their health care because of Trump's war on Obamacare.
That's right.
And yet, when they're asked, will you vote for him again, they say, yes, we'll still vote for him.
Well, there are some that will do that, but there's a remnant out there, and we're finding them. As I said, in Kentucky recently, our campaign spent 3 years in Kentucky, and what happened? Kentucky shifted, and a number of the counties we worked in for 3 years, they changed, they flipped. They flipped from Trump support to the support of the new Democratic governor. We didn't endorse the governor. We showed them the connections and how they were being played one against the other, and they got it and they decided to change. We have to remember that after the Civil War, for instance, black and white folk came together and changed the country. And every effort to pull black and white folk together has always been either assassinated or destroyed because, as Dr. King said, when that possibility is there, the aristocracy knows the danger of it to its political control on this country. We believe in our campaign, we have a moment in history that we can really work to change it. And it doesn't take much, 2%, 3%, 4% change in many of these states could fundamentally shift the political calculus.
So could fundamentally shift the political calculus with a big election coming up in November, the presidential election. Who do you think should be the best Democrat to fight this campaign on behalf of the poor against Donald Trump in November?
Well, we've not decided yet. We've not endorsed yet because this is what we're saying. First of all, we have 140 million people living in poverty, 43% of this nation. We've not had one debate televised on poverty. No candidate that's running to date has dealt with the 140 million number and dealt with the intersecting connections between systemic racism, ecological devastation, and the war economy.
That's a fair point.
Bits and pieces have come out, and we're thankful for that. And part of it is because of our campaign. More people are beginning to say bits and pieces in child poverty, and people talk about the working poor, as though poor people are not working. 700 people die a day from poverty, and we've not yet called it a national emergency. That is what we're listening for.
You said you haven't endorsed yet. Does that mean you will be endorsing someone prior to the DNC convention in July?
Well, we'll be having our big Poor People's Assembly before the convention, and what we've said to all the candidates, just like we did in Kentucky, we didn't endorse the governor, but the governor endorsed our issues and began to deal with the people's issues. We say to every candidate, if you deal with systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, take on religious nationalism in a frontal way, we have a moral justice budget. If you look at our budget that deals with the lie of scarcity and says we have the money, if you look at our analysis on the cost of poverty, not just the cost of fixing it, but what is the cost of poverty that's been done by some of the best economists in this country, we don't have to ask us to endorse your personality. Endorse the policies and the people will know who to come to and who to vote for. We are very political but nonpartisan.
Reverend Dr. William Barber, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you so much. God bless you. Take care.
Thank you. That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.